Hi. So I thought I'd have a little session on how I've done the backing and joining the rows together. So because we've now, with our bento block of the day, because we've now done a couple of complete rows, and how fun is that, I thought I'd show you how I'm going to be joining mine together. You of course may have a different way that you'd like to do it, and that's absolutely fine. So what I've done with my top row, with the first row, is I've gone ahead and I've cut my backing and I've done some very minimal quilting stitching on there as well, and I've trimmed it all down on the two long edges. I haven't trimmed the ends because I can do that at another stage. So just to show you how I've gone about that, I've suggested in the requirements some fabrics for backing, and I've suggested in this sheet of notes here that you cut some fabrics to a certain length so that you've got strips the full length of the row. So what I've suggested is our row is going to be, or is, all the backgrounds of our row currently measure 10.5 inches high. So, and we don't want to change that. We like the 10.5. It's going to be a 10-inch row when it's all finished. So I have also been working with the batting behind, so my batting is extending a little bit. So I'm suggesting that you cut the backing rows at 11.5 inches, so we've got a little bit of room to move. So we're cutting from a long length, and all this information is in these notes that I've sent you this time. So you need a really long row because the rows are quite long, 11.5 inches wide. So it's plenty long enough to cover the whole of that row. So that we're going to be doing 8 rows, so we need 8 of those in total. And the other thing, unfortunately, I've had a little bit of an error in some of the information I gave you at the beginning about the backing fabric. I had left out an amount that we need for some joining strips, so I do apologise. I've written some information about it on your notes. We need to put some joining strips on. When we're doing quilt as you go, most often there's some form of joining strip to cover the seam, and we're going to do that. We're going to be doing that on the back of the fabric, on the back of the quilt. But I thought, if you do need a couple of yards of the fabric, you could either use the same fabric as your backing, and that is what I'm doing, or you could use another colour. It would be fine if it's another colour. So I've cut my strips. Again, they need to be long strips, so I've suggested cutting them 72 inches. They're just a fraction longer than their backing pieces, just so they can stick out at each end. We can trim them off afterwards. They're 2.5 inches wide, so we just need one for every join. So again, I've mentioned how many we need of those in there. So once we've cut our backing and we've cut our joining strip, the joining strip needs to be folded in half lengthwise and pressed. So we've got a very long strip. It's just like a binding strip. It's very similar sort of process that we'll be going through, but I will show you what I've done. So we've got our joining strip, we've got our backing strip, and then we're going to position that with, and you may want to do a little bit of quilting on your row. So I've gone ahead and I've trimmed one side, but I'm going to trim the other one to show you what I've done. So I've put my backing piece behind, and because I've used a fusible batting, I was able to just fuse it just lightly, and then I've just done some rows of stitching, very minimalistic stitching, just on anything that's pretty much going all the way through upright, just near the seam, about 1/8 of an inch away. So I've done all that with my second row, and all I now need to do is trim that up, and then I can show you how I've joined it. So I'll just show you how I've done the trimming. It's really the same as any type of trimming, but it is quite a long strip, and I thought perhaps you might like to see what I've done. So I do recommend, if you can, having a long ruler for something long like this. It does help keep things straight overall, rather than having a shorter ruler that possibly could wibbly wobbly a little bit. So all we really wanted to do is trim everything to the size of the front background of our row. So you shouldn't be trimming anything off the front. It should all be lining up pretty well with the edge of your ruler along the edge of the fabrics there. And we're trimming away the backing and the batting, but not the front. So really it's just a matter of holding it in place, trimming it as far as you're able to reasonably reach, and then pulling it towards you and trimming some more. And as I said, I've already done the other side of this row, which is really good. It's going to happen, and so I'm going to finish off trimming this, and I'll come back and I'll show you how I've put it all together. So I've finished trimming up my second row, which is really exciting. They're looking really good. I haven't trimmed the ends, just the long edges. And then, so to put them together, there's a little bit of matching up, but not a huge amount. So earlier on, you would have had a diagram of the quilt layout like this. And so you can see where the lines join for the different rows. And so there's really only 2 places where seams actually have to match. How exciting is that? We only need to match up 2 things. So, but I think it's worth matching them. So what it happens to be is, this is my second row here. So on this tall lady here, this seam to the left of her, my left, matches up with this seam above. So I'm going to pop a pin in there. So I'm going to put them right sides together because we're going to be stitching them together, and I'm going to try and make sure that these seams sit absolutely together so that when we stitch it, it lines up, because that one is supposed to line up. And there's another one actually towards the other end of this of these 2 rows that needs to be matched as well. And so that's going to be this seam line here, this seam line, and this, if you look at this bit here, so this one to the right, on my right of the tall lady, and this line here, this seam also matches. So I need to make sure that they match, and I can put a pin in there, or clips, because pins are just a little bit sharp sometimes, so that everything matches. So we can also match the ends so that when we get to each end, we know everything is in the right place. Make sure your backing comes with it. And also we're going to be popping the joining strip on at the same time. So at this stage I would also put in at least just a couple of pins probably. Nothing needs to match. This should be sitting, it's quite long to show you everything. It should be sitting pretty flat together all the way along there, but I am just going to throw a couple of pins in just to make sure that things are not moving around, because it is so long and it wants to move all by itself. And then I've got my joining strip. So remember we had cut this, it was 2.5 inches wide, and I've pressed it in half. So it's like a long binding strip, and we're going to include that as we do the seam. So it's just going to be a regular 1/4 inch seam. I'm just going to make sure this end is matching up here. That's looking pretty good. And I can start with my strip as well there. So you could go along and pin the whole row, or you can just have that coming along as you get to it. I probably will have it as I get to it, but I will now go to the sewing machine, and I'm just going to start sewing here. It really is just a regular seam, but you've got all these layers, so just be aware of keeping all these raw edges together, and other than that you just need to sew that seam. So I'm just keeping my 1/4 inch seam allowance there. I've got to make sure everything stays lined up with those raw edges, and they're looking pretty good. I've got my jewel feed on. If you have a jewel feed on your machine, this is a really good time to make sure it's in place, because you've got all these layers and you don't want them to move. So mine is now in place. So jewel feed is a bit like a walking foot if you're not sure. The newer machines often have the jewel feed these days. So I'm just sewing a 1/4 inch seam all the way along. So I've got my joining strip and my 2 rows right sides together, and I'll come back and show it to you at the end when I get there and show you what we do next. So I'm just coming to the end. So I'm just going to pull these pins out. Kind of fun. Okay, so I've done my seam 1/4 inch away. I've got my joining strip attached. I'm going to open it out and make sure that everything's looking good on this side. And so far it is. So there's going to be just a tiny bump where that seam is, because we have included the batting, but it really won't be too bad because we're actually going to press that seam open. Everything is looking pretty good. So what I'm going to do now is bring the iron over, and we've got our joining strip sitting there. That's fine, it can sit there quite happily at the moment. And I'm going to press this seam open all the way along so that the batting disperses a little bit. So nothing terribly complicated in that sense. Just take your time, press that seam open, let that joining strip just sit there for now. So I'll go ahead and press my whole seam open, and then I'll come and show you what I'm going to do with that joining strip and how we're going to attach it. So I've gone ahead and I've pressed my seam open all the way along. It takes a little bit of time. It's only a fairly small seam and quite a long one, but that's okay. So it's sitting quite nicely and fairly flat, which is good. I've got my joining strip flapping around here. So by pressing that flat, what I now want to do is use this joining strip to flip over there, and it's a touch wide. So what we're trying to do is sort of balance it. We want it to be just a little bit wide past the raw edges of the seam, and probably the same on this side with a fold. So I'm just going to press that over and just keep an eye that it's just a little bit past that seam allowance, and that should give us quite a nice little covering for that seam. Now I'm going to suggest that you might like to hand stitch this down, just like you would hand stitch down a binding. So I'm just pressing that now so that it's already in place for you to do some hand stitching. I'm just going to turn it round so that you can just see it from the other angle as well. So what we've done here was we've pressed that over, and it is a little bit away from the raw edges, which is good, and it'll be hopefully a similar amount away on this side. But what it means is, because we stitched it into the seam, it's going to kind of flap a little bit. Now you could just leave it like that, but I'm going to suggest that you might like to hand sew down either side so that it's sitting really nicely across the back of your quilt. And as I mentioned before, these could be a different colour. They don't have to match none of your backings. You could have all different strips on your backings. You can do whatever you like on the back. I'm going to do mine all the same, and they'll almost disappear by having them in a similar fabric like that. So hand stitching down either side. Now I have mentioned in the notes that you could machine stitch it just a little 1/4 of an inch away either side from the front side, and that would catch that in, but it may not catch it in as close or as exact as you might like it to. So I'm going to let you decide if you want to hand or machine stitch it, because when you machine stitch from the other side you can't kind of see exactly where it is, and it may wander a little bit, or it may be a bit close to the edge somewhere. So there's that to consider, but it would be possible with it like that. Otherwise you won't see anything on the front if you just hand stitch it, and it's just going to look just like this looks, and I think it's looking pretty good. So that's, I have to show it to you in sections now. And that's the other part there. So I think when that's joined like that, it's looking nice. You don't need to have another stitching line on it unless you want to put it there, and just a little bit of hand stitching along the back would be absolutely amazing. And I'm not really a hand stitcher. So that's how I'm going to be joining my rows. So every time we complete another row, we'll be doing it in exactly the same way. Just have a look on the pattern that came earlier, just to see if anything needs to line up, so that you can line up any that do need to. Other than that, just make sure everything fits nicely and sits nicely, and that's how we're joining our rows.